Hi guys, welcome to Monocular 3D Pro Tips. Today we're going to check out the latest offering from Anycubic. It's their Ultra DLP. This one we got from Kickstarter. I'm not sure why it took so long to get here, but anyway, it's here now. So let's check it out right now. I've been told that the best way to open printers by one of you guys who watches Pro Tips is from the bottom. So let's do that way and see. It's always good to see an outer cover here in case it does get rained on. This piece of paper can be used for leveling. It's got a manual here. Obviously that's the Chinese side and we've got English this side. Now these manuals from Anycubic are quite clear now. There's good photos. It's a very simple how to set up and start printing without having to go online, which is quite good because it's good to have on the bench beside you when you're setting it up. A mask, this is probably good if you are worried about getting COVID. And the filter, these filters are good. They always come in handy. Power adapter, nice to see the Australian plug there. The metal scraper, this is always handy to get things off the build plate. Never use this in the vat. As you know, I've said that 1,000 times. This is the one for the vat. This is the plastic scraper, which is perfect for the vat because you can see it's got the nice round corners there and no sharp edges, and it's not going to pierce the FEP film. Some gloves, they always come in handy as well, of course. It's got the pass from their quality control stamp there with the date, and a few Allen keys obviously do things like removing the FEP sheet. There's a USB. We generally don't use these because sometimes they can cause problems and stop the print halfway through. Always recommend to get a decent one. The last thing you need is your print to stop after 20 hours. See how they've packaged this? It's actually very solid. It's not going to be damaged in transport. It's packaged very well actually. It's quite lightweight. So they've done a good job here of keeping the accessory parts in here. Obviously there's the vat. Very lightweight actually, and it's got the lines in here so you can see how much resin you've got in there. The build plate, let's have a look at that. Okay, so they've gone with the checker laser etch build plate. We first saw this on the Mono X. I don't know if they did it on some of the previous smaller printers, but it's actually a very good addition to a build plate. It really helps with the adhesion of the resin to the build plate. In some cases, it's probably okay to turn the normal bottom layers down because the adhesion's too good, and I know some people find it hard to get off. We did a Pro Tips bite a while ago. We'll put the link somewhere showing how to use hot water to remove the prints over the back of the build plate. It's a pretty standard build plate. There's not much to it. It's got the 4 leveling screws here. It's got the beveled edge, which helps with the drainage of the resin. Okay, just having a look at it, you can see straight away that this is plastic. Not really a massive fan of plastic cases, I have to say. I'd always like to see these in aluminium, but I understand they're trying to keep the costs down. It's not a bad looking case. They've gone with a grey-blue colour, which is quite nice, and it goes quite well with the blue lid. Now this is the first blue lid I've seen in this sort of range. Resin printers, usually they're a yellow. Anycubic's always been a yellow or an orange colour. Creality use orange. Anything that blocks the UV light from entering in. Let me just quickly explain the technology behind a DLP, and I'm sure if you're watching this you probably already know, so I'll make it very brief. DLP compared to MSLA, which uses a screen, an LCD screen, and cuts the shape with an LCD screen. The DLP uses a projector module, so very similar to the projector we've got running this projection on the wall here. The black obviously would not be the area that would be cured, and the text there, the Anycubic Ultra DLP, in this case would be using the 405 nanometer UV light, which would set the resin off. Now that was what would be exposed. So it works in a similar way to the MSLA, but rather than the screen cutting the shape, it's the projector module itself. Traditionally, projector modules have been expensive, and they've obviously come down in price a lot. I think this was sub $400 US, this printer, to be able to create a DLP printer for that sort of money. So traditionally, you would see upwards of 5,000 Australian dollars for a DLP printer. They're considered to be better quality and sharper detail because you're not restricted by the pixel dimensions of the screen. And obviously you're restricted by the pixel dimensions of the projector module, but in a lot of cases they're going to be higher, better resolution. So this one, for example, is 720, which is just HD. It was kind of like the first HD that came out before 1080p. Now if I flick the printer up like this, just in front of the projector module there is a mirror. Now that mirror is on a 45-degree angle, and that's going to reflect the image straight up to the screen. So that is how, when they first started producing these printers, so a lot of them literally just had a overhead projector like the one we're using here that projected up from the bottom, so that it was a very tall bottom. Now, being able to put just a projector module in and off a mirror means that, you know, the only really distance here is the width of it here, and not having to have the whole thing coming up from the bottom. Like the screens in MSLA, that piece of glass there in this printer, in a DLP printer, is very, very important that that stays unscratched. So really need to take special care with that piece of glass, and also make sure it's clean. So let's just have a quick look around the printer now. Quite a small touchscreen, but it's a pretty small printer. Bit of venting here on the side. They put the power on the side, and just behind that is the USB. I always like seeing the USB on the front just because it's easier to access from the front. Just having a quick look at the Z-axis. They've got this top cover on here. There's no attachment up here. They got rid of any sort of a bearing at the top. They've decided that with this type of Z-axis and setup, you don't need that to be attached. In fact, it's better not to have it attached. I'm never a huge fan, and I know it's hard to get away from, but this hole in here, to me, that's got disaster written all over it, and it's a resin trap and a spot where resin could potentially go down. It doesn't take much for these to pop. It can literally be a tiny little piece of cured resin that's in there. The build plate goes down, it'll pierce the FEP sheet, and then before you know it, you have resin over your screen, or in this case the glass, and then in that hole, and then it's in the stepper motor, and you've got a mess and a potential disaster where you're replacing this whole thing. So just down here you can see the sensor. On some of the printers they're putting the sensor at the top, which is kind of annoying because it means that it's got to go all the way up for it to sense and then come all the way back down. John just mentioned in the background there that it could be to do with the splatter factor if you get resin, again, as I mentioned in here, but you could also get it on that sensor, and that could be problematic. It's got the power, little power thing there. It's plug in, the adapter's obviously there as well. And then this just slides in here. It's got these little divots, I guess you call it. Now, interestingly, it's not just got the one in the middle, it's got them at the back and at the front. So I can understand why it's got the middle one. I don't understand why it's got these two. Maybe it was an aesthetics thing or a design thing, but to be honest, you'd never really want to be doing that anyway. We'll ponder that. If anyone knows, again, put it in the comments. I'd be very interested to know. Okay, I'm going to quickly go through the specs here for you. So there's a 2.8 inch LCD screen on the front there. The optical wavelength is 405 nanometers, which is standard for most of these printers these days. The optical resolution is 1280 by 720, as I mentioned. The dimensions is 222 by 227 by 383 millimeters. The weight is 4 kilos. That'll be the whole weight of the printer. The XY precision is 0.08 millimeters. The Z-axis precision is 0.01, so that's 10 microns. The layer thickness is 0.01 to 0.15. Print dimensions 102.4 by 57.6 by 165 millimeters. So a couple of quick facts for you here. As I mentioned, this was a Kickstarter campaign printer. It got 4,094 backers. They pledged over 18 million Hong Kong dollars, which is roughly around 3 million Australian dollars to bring this project to life. So they certainly got enough money to launch this. Potentially around 4,000 printers went out. The best thing to do now, I've had a good look at it, and you know, really we need to turn this thing on and see how it prints. And the best person to do that is, of course, John, who runs our print lab downstairs. So John, I'm going to hand this over to you now. Take it downstairs, run it through its paces, and I really look forward to hearing what you think.
Okay, Charlie, I've had a couple of weeks to go over it and work out exactly what works, what doesn't work. Overall, I'm impressed with the way DLP produces a really sharp, contrasty surface on details on the models. It does a really lovely job. One of the first things I tackled was a particularly difficult Eiffel Tower. And normally when we print these Eiffel Towers, we get a lot of resin build up inside this spire at the top here because of the density of it. And in this case, there wasn't any at all. It was remarkably clean. The detail that's inside here on the railings is really good, far better than what I've seen on regular LCD type printers. But once again, it comes down to DLP. It's a very contrasty type of method of getting UV light onto that surface. With the LCD, the light is in focus, provided what you're focusing on is right on the surface of that LCD screen. But with DLP, there's a bit of give in it. I can be like 10 centimeters above that surface and it's still fairly sharp. So black pixels, there's no pixels, it's completely dark where there's no light. The DLP will only project a shaft of light for each individual pixel that is super sharp, and it produces really nice prints. The downsides with this particular machine is they've gone cost cutting at some point here and decided let's work within the budget of what we've got here. Now the Texas Instruments DLP unit, in this case it's a 720p, it probably cost them X amount and left them with a budget for the rest of the machine. They've scrimped a bit on the Z motor. The Z motor is really underpowered. If you've got any models that have a cross section, say, bigger than that, it has a habit of skipping steps when it tries to peel it off the FEP sheet, which is not great. It kind of reduces the number of models that you can use on this machine to small figurines like this. Certainly that worked because there's not a lot of cross-sectional area. That's fine if you're planning on doing little figurines. In fact, that's probably the largest model I would even consider using on this. Now, the build area is not very large on this machine, so you really are using up the build area on that with that particular model. But anything larger than that, and I was having all sorts of problems with the Z motor skipping. So that's kind of a shame. I can't imagine there's anything I can really do to resolve that to make the Z motor stronger. The other thing I did is focus mainly on the porcelain because that shows you the level of detail you can get on the surface of the model. I did use their suggested resin, which in this case was their Anycubic Craftsman. It's similar to the porcelain, but it doesn't have the same sort of contrasty detail that we have with our porcelain. But you know, both resins certainly do work. And also interestingly, online they list the Craftsman in brackets with DLP, so I'm not sure what that's about. Maybe they just found that was the better resin for this particular printer. It was running at about 3 seconds, which is quite slow. With our porcelain, we're a bit faster. But certainly, from everything I read online, it seemed to indicate that this printer was fast. But it really isn't. The exposure times I was finding with the resin on this machine were a bit slower than when I was getting on the Mono X, even at 60% power. There's no power option on this. You can't change the power of the UV on it. It's at 100%. But even that is not very fast. The other thing I have to take into consideration is the support tips that I'm using. If I've got a model with lots of supports, those support tips have to be a little bit bigger. The reason for that is that the support tips are basically going to be either right in the middle of a DLP pixel or off to the side of it. Now, DLP doesn't have a lot of blur like it would with an LCD screen, so there's not going to be a lot of extra curing going around that support tip to make it stronger. The support tip will either be the right size or slightly small, so the safe thing to do is just to make your support tips a little bit bigger. The other problem I found with this is the vat. As Charlie pointed out, it's plastic. And if we have a look at that, you can see that when they've tightened the FEP, the sides of that plastic vat have been pulled inwards. Now that's not great. That's going to change the shape of the vat itself, and it's not going to sit perfectly flat on the glass here. So fortunately, what we found is the size of that vat is exactly the same as the Anycubic Photon SE, and it's made of aluminium on the SE. So if you've got an SE, that's great. You can use the aluminium vat. Otherwise, you might need to go searching online for a replacement vat for the SE, which will work perfectly well on the DLP. The other thing I may suggest, replace these plastic knobs, because Anycubic are infamous for using a plastic that disintegrates over time due to the vapors that come off resin. We do have a few replacement knobs that I've managed to find online. Essentially, these are the same knobs that I found online for the Photon SE. They work on this machine as well, which is good. Plus, we've got some little screws that I'm going to go hunting for from the same provider on eBay, and I'll replace these knobs as well before they disintegrate. It's generally a very nice printer for doing beautiful models that are about this sort of size, and I think in future I will probably relegate this sort of print to this machine because of the detail it gives me, but I'm certainly really happy with the other Anycubic printers as well. This one was just a bit off-center. Interesting that it's got DLP and 720p. 720p I was kind of thinking would be a bit low resolution, but certainly from the prints I'm not getting that. The other thing I noticed is the build plate. Where it attaches the block here to the actual build plate itself, it's slightly skew if it's twisted that way. So when you attach it to the screw here, the plate's actually sitting slightly skew-if, which is not great. It still works, but that's just, you know, something that they really need to concentrate a little bit more on. Certainly a lot of plastic used in this, but they have used metal where it does count. The base plate here is made of metal attached to the vertical for the Z lead screw and the linear bearing. That's good, but eventually this is going to start getting corroded by resin drops that get attached to the lid. Now I've noticed a little bit on the edge here, there's a little bit of corrosion happening from a bit of resin that's got trapped between the lid and the plastic there. So that, I'm imagining, is going to get worse over time. So let's have a closer look at the guts of this machine. You can see straight away that there is a clear piece of glass here. It's really just there to support the bottom of the vat. There's a mirror directly below that, which then reflects the image through that lens there from the DLP unit that you can see just at the bottom. So if I turn this light off and turn on the light, we'll be able to see what that looks like. So it's like a bright point of light that goes out in a beam. Now, if I get a piece of paper, think of this as your TV projector screen at home, and the DLP projector is focused on that surface there. As I raise it up, see how it's still pretty much in focus. With LCD, that's a complete blurry mess if I raise it about 20 millimeters off the surface. That's the difference between DLP and LCD. It's a lot sharper. The other thing is the UV light that's used in there. Potentially they could put a stronger one in there if they wanted to. Potentially they could adjust the power of UV light that's on there. It's just an LED. But it's a really simple system, and the simplicity of that is a really great feature. And I kind of wish Texas Instruments would drop their prices of their modules so that this became mainstream. Because at the moment, the sweet spot price-wise for manufacturers is LCD screens. Even the high definition ones, the 6Ks, the 8Ks, they're becoming more affordable for manufacturers. If you have a look at the logo on the front here, you'll see it's got DLP Texas Instruments. Texas Instruments has the patent on their DLP technology. It's essentially a micro mirror with, in this case, a 720p resolution that sits on a circuit board, and the light shines on that mirror and gets reflected off. The mirrors just turn slightly to make that light go off to a different direction when the pixel is off. Now, they're the only company that have that technology because they have a patent on it. And because they've got a patent on that technology, they can charge whatever they want for it. So, unfortunately, these modules do cost a bit of money. Hopefully this patent will expire sometime soon so that other manufacturers can get on board with this technology, because it's actually very good. So setting up this printer is essentially no different from any other resin printer I've ever used. Essentially you put your vat in there, lock it in place, you do your leveling as you normally would, loosening the screws, homing it, tightening the screws, that's no different. And then it's just purely a matter of sticking the resin in there and slicing. Now, as far as slicers are concerned, the only slicer I could find, well, the one I was able to get for free, was their own Photon Workshop. But there was a very specific version that I had to download, which actually had support for the Photon Ultra. So I had to use that to do the slicing to produce the DLP files that this printer supports. However, I still did created the supports in Box Pro because it does a very good job of that. Lychee does support it, from what I can tell, but I think possibly you need to have a paid version for that. But slicing is no different from any other printer. So all in all, a nice little printer. I don't know whether I would pay that amount for what you're getting, but it does nice little figurines. If you're in the market for doing this type of printing, perfect. Downside, plastic vat, plastic body, limited slices, but all that should improve over time, I hope. Being a Kickstarter, they were kind of testing the waters here. The people who bought this will have positives, negatives to say about it, but all in all, I would say Anycubic will be taking that feedback, and I would say their next machine will be taking all of that on board, a stronger stepper motor, a metal vat, possibly even a metal base similar to the SE. The next one is probably going to be a bit better than this. So we'll see what happens. Watch this space, but this machine for a first attempt from Anycubic is pretty good. I'll throw back to you, Charlie. Enjoy, guys.
Thanks a lot, John. So there you have it, guys, the Anycubic Ultra DLP printer. Impressive stuff. Great to see them using this new technology. Guys, If you like the channel, please subscribe, hit that notification button, but most importantly, remember to keep on 3D printing.